They danced in circles for hours, men, women, children, their arms raised, dust kicking beneath their feet. Shirts painted with sacred symbols clung to sweat-soaked skin as the chant rose, rhythmic, raw, relentless. Faces streaked with red earth, eyes closed in trance. This was not war. It was not rebellion. But from a distance to the US soldiers watching with binoculars, it didn't look peaceful. It looked like something was about to erupt. 1,000 Lakota in motion, caught in a movement they believed would bring the dead back and sweep the white man from the land. And as you listen now, maybe you're far from those plains, perhaps in Rapid City, finishing dinner and scrolling before bed, or in New York, letting the hum of the city fade as you listen, or maybe in Dublin, lying still as midnight rain taps against your window. Wherever you are, this moment still echoes, a memory of belief, fear, and the misunderstanding that changed a nation. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and if you want to keep uncovering the hidden sides of Native American history, subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now back to the plains. Orders began to shift, troops mobilized, and somewhere inside the unease someone whispered the name, Wovoka. But who was he? What did he preach? How did a spiritual prophecy turn into what authorities were now calling an outbreak? Before the bullets and blood at Wounded Knee, before the cavalry encircled Pine Ridge, there was only a vision, one seen in the snowfields of Nevada, far from the rising tension on the northern plains. Wovoka, a northern Paiute man born in western Nevada, first gained attention during the eclipse of 1889. He claimed to have died from a fever and returned with a message from the other world. There, he said, he had met the Creator. He saw lands restored, buffalo herds returned, and native ancestors alive again. But the Creator's promise came with conditions. Native people had to live peacefully, reject alcohol, and perform the ghost dance regularly. The ritual, performed for 5 consecutive days, would hasten the renewal of the world. His message spread quickly. Delegates from dozens of tribes, Arapaho, Lakota, Cheyenne, Kiowa, travelled west to hear him speak. They returned transformed, carrying a faith more powerful than any weapon. Among the Lakota, who had suffered broken treaties, land seizure, starvation, and cultural suppression, Wovoka's vision ignited hope. It wasn't just a dance. It was the last chance to reverse destruction. By the spring of 1890, the movement had taken hold on the reservations of South Dakota. Hundreds began gathering. The US government called it disturbing. The Lakota called it sacred. On both sides, something was building, and neither fully understood what the other saw in the dust. To the US agents stationed on reservations, the sudden gatherings felt suspicious. Remote hillsides were filled with people moving in unison, their white-painted shirts bearing symbols believed to stop bullets. Some dancers collapsed from exhaustion, speaking in tongues or claiming visions. Field reports labelled it fanatical. In truth, it was organised. Camp circles were laid out with purpose, elders oversaw the rituals, and food was shared communally. No weapons were allowed during the dance. It was spiritual preparation, not militant planning. But on paper, the reports painted a different picture. The Bureau of Indian Affairs grew nervous. Officials feared that the ghost dance might lead to an uprising, not because of any violence, but because of the unity it created. By fall 1890, the Pine Ridge and Standing Rock agencies saw participation surge. It was not isolated, it was coordinated, and in Washington, pressure mounted. Something had to be done before this dangerous religion slipped out of control. But the problem wasn't guns or speeches, it was belief. A belief strong enough to defy starvation and grief. Strong enough to make broken people feel they still had a world to win back. That was what terrified the authorities most. Among the Lakota, the ghost dance became more than a prophecy. It was a lifeline. After years of forced relocations, buffalo slaughter and ration cuts, communities were collapsing. The dance gave them structure. It gave elders a role again, songs a purpose again, and the young something to believe in. The movement also challenged Christian missionaries and US attempts at assimilation. School teachers reported boys skipping class to join dances. Converts to Christianity rejoined their traditional communities. Ghost shirts were sewn by the dozens. Lakota prophets like Kicking Bear and Short Bull returned from Nevada with Wovoka's message and infused it with local meaning. For them, the coming change wasn't just spiritual, it would be physical. total. They believed the ground would shake, the white man swallowed, and the buffalo rise again. The US read this as sedition, but for Lakota families, it was prophecy. As autumn drew on, entire bands began to travel seeking larger gatherings, and from across the plains, eyes turned toward the Badlands and the Black Hills, where the biggest dances yet were forming. Soldiers weren't yet firing, but they were watching. Tension crackled. Belief and suspicion were marching toward a confrontation. By late November 1890, the US military presence on the plains had shifted dramatically. Nearly 3,000 troops were deployed to Indian agencies in the Dakota Territory. General Nelson A. Miles, the same man who had pursued Geronimo in the southwest, now directed operations. He believed the ghost dance was a growing military threat. Telegraph wires hummed with reports. Forts were reactivated. Cavalry units moved to key crossings and reservation borders. A message from President Benjamin Harrison authorized the use of force if needed. But force against what? There were no war parties, no fortified camps, just people dancing. The Lakota saw the soldiers and knew what that usually meant. Some bands scattered, others dug in. Among US commanders there was debate. Some believed the movement would fade if ignored. Others wanted decisive action. At the centre of it all was a name that kept resurfacing: Sitting Bull. Though not a ghost dancer himself, his influence remained strong. The Indian agent at Standing Rock labelled him a disturbing presence. Orders were drawn, surveillance increased. And on a cold December morning a decision was made, one that would transform spiritual tension into military violence. The first death was only days away. The morning of December 15, 1890 was bitterly cold at the Standing Rock Agency. Snow crunched under cavalry boots as Indian police quietly surrounded the cabin of Sitting Bull. Inside, the Hunkpapa Lakota leader was sleeping. He had been warned of arrest the night before, but refused to flee. The US Indian agent, James McLaughlin, had requested his detention, believing his influence was fueling the ghost dance movement. Though Sitting Bull had not personally participated, many of his followers had. The Bureau saw him as a symbol of resistance, and symbols in tense times were treated like threats. Just before sunrise, the officers entered. What followed was brief and violent. Sitting Bull was pulled from bed. A crowd gathered. Angry voices rose. In the scuffle, shots rang out. Sitting Bull was struck in the head and chest. He died in the dirt outside his cabin. Lakota followers fired back. In minutes, 6 policemen and several of Sitting Bull's people lay dead. The government labelled it a necessary arrest. To the Lakota, it was an execution. That morning, something broke. Many fled the agency. Some joined nearby ghost dancers. Others began heading south. The panic that the US feared was now real. Word of Sitting Bull's death travelled quickly. By midday, Indian agents at other agencies were alerting military posts. At Pine Ridge, Agent Daniel Royer, already nervous from weeks of ghost dance gatherings, sent frantic telegrams. He called for troops, claiming he was surrounded by hostiles preparing for war. In reality, the dancers remained peaceful, but fear distorted every movement, every chant, into a signal of attack. The US Army responded swiftly. General Nelson A. Miles ordered reinforcements into the territory. Infantry and cavalry units rode in from forts Niobrara and Robinson. Gatling guns were brought in. Telegraph lines hummed. The 7th Cavalry, once Custer's command, was dispatched again, this time to South Dakota. Meanwhile, bands of Lakota began to move. Many fled Pine Ridge in fear of arrest or violence. Some sought refuge with Spotted Elk, leader of the Minneconjou, camped near the Cheyenne River. Others vanished into the Badlands. Tension turned the snow-covered prairies into a chessboard. Columns of soldiers advanced. Camps shifted. Orders were vague but clear. Suppress the ghost dance, contain the people. Yet no one knew what would trigger the next shot. The killing of Sitting Bull had started a chain reaction, and now both sides were moving. At Fort Yates and Fort Meade, soldiers packed their winter gear, rations and ammunition. Officers briefed men on the ghost dance, describing it as a cult-stirring rebellion. Most had never seen a ghost dance, nor spoken to those involved. They operated on reports filtered through frightened agents and newspapers spreading panic. Some articles claimed the dancers were preparing for a great Indian uprising, though no such plans existed. Meanwhile, tribal messengers moved across the plains, trying to keep scattered families informed. Many Lakota were unsure what the government intended. Some thought removal was coming, others feared mass arrests, As troops approached Pine Ridge, families began to pack. Teepees came down, sleds were loaded, entire bands moved in the snow, uncertain of where safety lay. Few trusted the promises of peace. Just 2 weeks before, the same promises had brought death to Sitting Bull. Even agency police, native men employed by the government, were caught in the middle, forced to act against their own people or risk retaliation. For the Lakota, there were no good choices left. Each step was a calculation: flee or stay, submit or resist. Behind every decision now stood the shadow of the soldiers closing in. On December 23, 1890, Spotted Elk's band began moving south toward the Pine Ridge Agency. Nearly 350 people travelled together, men, women and children, many of them sick or elderly. They carried what they could on travois and sleds, wrapped in blankets and buffalo hides. Spotted Elk, already ill with pneumonia, rode in a wagon under layers of cloth. They were not looking for a fight. They were seeking safety under Red Cloud's protection at Pine Ridge. The army, however, had different orders. Major Samuel Whitside and elements of the 7th Cavalry intercepted the band near Porcupine Butte. Spotted Elk did not resist. He raised a white flag and allowed soldiers to escort his group to Wounded Knee Creek. There, they were told to camp. Soldiers surrounded them with 4 Hotchkiss guns placed on nearby hills. Officially, it was a peaceful detention. In reality, it was an armed encirclement. That night, temperatures dropped below freezing. Soldiers ate from packed rations. Lakota families burned dried grass for heat. Spotted Elk's people remained under guard, unaware that higher orders were already being discussed. Commanders wanted disarmament. Officers debated strategy. Tensions lingered in the cold. By morning, the decision would be made. At Army headquarters, Colonel James Forsyth received his orders: disarm the Lakota. The next morning, December 29th, would begin with a weapons search. Officers believed that hidden rifles could spark violence. The goal was to secure the camp without conflict, but soldiers were tense, cold, and many were inexperienced. Some still harboured resentment from the Little Bighorn. Meanwhile, inside the Lakota camp, people woke before dawn. Fires were lit. Children huddled close. A few men cleaned rifles, heirlooms or tools for hunting, not battle. None knew what to expect. Around 8 a.m., the soldiers began moving into position. Interpreters were summoned. A request was made: surrender all weapons. Some complied, others hesitated. A few rifles were buried in snow or hidden in blankets, unsure if surrender would bring safety or arrest. Arguments broke out. Soldiers grew impatient. Lakota leaders tried to keep order. Spotted Elk remained on the ground, too sick to rise. The scene grew louder. Suddenly a shot rang out. No one agreed on who fired first, but what followed was chaos. Within seconds, gunfire erupted from both sides. Soldiers opened fire into the camp. The moment the army had feared, and perhaps provoked, was now real. As the snow deepened across the Dakota plains, bands of Lakota scattered. News of Sitting Bull's death and the growing military presence spread fast. Families that had once hoped peace might hold began leaving their agency camps. Some moved at night, others in open daylight, travelling in groups too large to ignore. Among them were ghost dance followers, families afraid of arrest, and elders remembering older wars. Many of these bands headed south toward the Miniconjou leader, Spotted Elk, known to the US as Big Foot. His camp, located near the Cheyenne River, had become a gathering point. Though Spotted Elk was ill and not seeking conflict, he welcomed those in need. His band swelled as others joined, bringing few possessions but heavy fears. He ordered no resistance. His priority was survival. By late December, his camp held over 300 people. When word came that the army was advancing, he made a decision: move toward Pine Ridge and seek protection under Red Cloud. On December 23rd, they began their journey. The weather was harsh. Children were bundled tightly in buffalo robes. Sleds creaked under weight. The trail was long, but staying meant arrest, or worse. They walked for safety, not war. The US Army tracked their movement from the start. Scouts reported the position of Spotted Elk's band as it moved southeast. Commanders wanted to avoid a scattered breakout, so troops were ordered to intercept. Major Samuel Whitside led elements of the 7th Cavalry from Fort Bennett. On December 28th, he located the camp near Porcupine Butte. Spotted Elk's people were cold, exhausted, and low on supplies. When approached, Spotted Elk raised a white flag. He offered no resistance. Whitside accepted his surrender and ordered the group to move to Wounded Knee Creek, a flat area just south of the White River. There they were told to camp. Soldiers set up perimeter positions and brought up 4 Hotchkiss guns. Additional reinforcements under Colonel Forsyth were en route. The army reported the situation as under control, but the encampment resembled a detainment zone. That night, Lakota families cooked what little they had over small fires. Guards patrolled the outer edge. Soldiers dug in for the cold. Spotted Elk remained in his wagon, barely able to speak. He had done everything to avoid conflict, but around them, bayonets fixed and orders whispered, a trap had closed. The next morning would not be ordinary. At Wounded Knee Creek, soldiers organised their positions methodically. Infantry formed a cordon around the Lakota camp, while cavalry units secured nearby routes. The 4 Hotchkiss guns were placed strategically on elevated ground, with clear line of sight into the teepees below. These were rapid-fire artillery weapons capable of shredding human bodies in seconds. Inside the Lakota camp, people were uneasy but compliant. Scouts, women and elders moved cautiously, avoiding sudden gestures. Tensions were unspoken but visible. Spotted Elk's men surrendered some firearms that evening. Others hid weapons under blankets, unsure if disarming would truly protect them. The soldiers issued strict orders. No one could leave the camp. At the edge of the circle, officers prepared the next morning's plan, complete disarmament. Captain Allen Capron, who had fought in the earlier Plains conflicts, warned of the volatility of the situation, but his advice was overruled by command. Colonel Forsyth believed control had been established. Inside the camp, mothers fed children thin broth and bundled them near fire pits. Drummers remained silent. The ghost dance had ended days earlier. What remained was a desperate stillness. Lakota survival now depended not on prophecy, but on how the next orders would be given and received. That night, temperatures dropped sharply. Soldiers took turns on watch rotations, bundled in wool coats and bedrolls, rifles close at hand. Lakota men stayed awake in shifts, whispering among themselves. The night passed without incident. At dawn on December 29th, the sun rose over frozen ground. Soldiers formed ranks around the camp. Captain George D. Wallace assembled a squad to begin the disarmament. Lakota men were ordered to gather in the centre, while women and children remained near their teepees. Interpreters translated the demands clearly. All firearms were to be surrendered. Some complied immediately, placing rifles and hatchets in a pile. Others hesitated or resisted, insisting they had no weapons. Tensions escalated when a man named Black Coyote refused to give up his rifle. Accounts vary. Some say he was deaf. Others that he didn't understand the order. Soldiers tried to seize his gun. A struggle followed. A shot rang out. In seconds, chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded from both sides. The soldiers opened fire at point-blank range. Bullets tore through teepees and bodies alike. The Hotchkiss guns fired from above. Screams filled the air. It was not a battle. It was the beginning of a massacre, uncontrolled and unstoppable. What began as a weapons search turned into a scene of devastation. Within minutes, Lakota men were cut down in the centre of the camp. Some tried to fight back with old rifles or knives. Most had nothing. Women and children fled in all directions, chased by gunfire. Soldiers fired into the fleeing crowd. Teepees burned. Smoke and snow filled the air. The Hotchkiss guns kept firing even as people tried to escape. By the time it ended, over 250 Lakota were dead, many of them women and children. 25 soldiers also died, some from friendly fire. The army later claimed the action was necessary and defensive. Eyewitnesses, including some soldiers, disagreed. What had been called a pacification mission ended in one of the bloodiest massacres in US military history. As bodies were collected, the temperature dropped further. Many of the wounded froze before help arrived. A burial detail was sent days later. Most were placed in a mass grave. There was no ceremony. Survivors, those few who lived, were taken into custody. Wounded Knee was now quiet again. But the ground beneath the snow held more than footprints. It held a memory that could not be disarmed or buried. The morning after the massacre, the wind swept across Wounded Knee Creek in silence. Smoke still curled from charred teepees. Bodies lay motionless in the snow, men, women, children, some frozen where they had fallen. Soldiers moved among the dead, collecting weapons, tagging corpses and searching for wounded. The command reported the incident as a military engagement, noting 25 soldiers killed and a large number of enemy dead. but there had been no enemy army, no organised resistance. What lay on the frozen ground were families. Survivors, dazed and shivering, were gathered under guard. Most had lost relatives, some had lost everyone. US officers sent for burial teams, but the weather delayed arrival. For 3 days, bodies remained exposed to the cold. Crows gathered. Journalists arrived next, photographing the scene and interviewing survivors. The army issued statements defending its actions. They claimed the Hotchkiss guns had been necessary to suppress hostiles. But even sympathetic officers privately admitted that something had gone terribly wrong. The massacre was over, but its evidence covered the field. It was the deadliest single act of violence in the Indian Wars. And though soldiers stood victorious, the cost was beginning to settle on both sides of the line. When the burial party finally arrived on January 1st, 1891, they began clearing the field with military precision. Dozens of bodies, many stripped by scavengers or looters, were gathered into a mass grave on a hill nearby. The frozen ground was difficult to break. Soldiers worked with picks and shovels, dropping body after body into the pit. Lakota families were not permitted to perform traditional burials. There was no ceremony, no prayer. Most victims were unnamed, their identities known only to their kin. Journalists from the East Coast documented the process, and soon images from Wounded Knee began to appear in national newspapers. Public reaction was mixed. Some saw it as the tragic end of Indian resistance. Others praised the military for preventing what they believed had been a coming rebellion. Back in Washington, Congress began receiving petitions, some demanding accountability, others requesting medals. In the following weeks, 20 soldiers from the 7th Cavalry received the Medal of Honor. It was one of the largest such awards ever given for a single action. Critics questioned the decision. Even at the time, some argued that honouring troops for killing civilians stained the medal's purpose, but the army stood by its decision. As the official reports were finalised, the military narrative hardened. The massacre was reframed as a battle. Commanders emphasised the difficulty of the situation, the threat of an armed breakout, and the confusion caused by Black Coyote's resistance. Colonel Forsyth was temporarily relieved of duty pending investigation, but soon reinstated. General Nelson A. Miles, however, offered a different assessment. He called Wounded Knee a frightful massacre and criticised the deployment of Hotchkiss guns against a mixed camp of non-combatants. In private letters and later public statements, Miles argued that poor leadership and panic had turned a tense situation into a slaughter. Still, these voices were exceptions. The War Department maintained its position. For most Americans reading newspaper headlines, the story was over. The frontier had been pacified. Indian resistance was finished. But for the Lakota and other Plains tribes watching from a distance, the massacre signalled something deeper, the closing of any space for negotiation, faith, or cultural survival. It was not just the ghost dance that had been destroyed. It was the belief that peaceful coexistence might still be possible. What followed was not open war, but a spreading silence, a loss that could not be measured in weapons or bodies. In the weeks after Wounded Knee, the US Army remained active in the Dakota Territory. Patrols continued across the plains, checking reservation borders and searching for any remaining ghost dance activity. At Pine Ridge, hundreds of displaced Lakota, survivors, refugees and returnees crowded the agency. Food was scarce, shelter was minimal. Disease began to spread. Government agents, now less alarmed by the dance, focused on containment and assimilation. Religious groups increased efforts to convert native children. Federal policy shifted back toward allotment and boarding schools. The ghost dance, once a unifying force, had nearly vanished. Some still whispered prayers. A few elders carried on the rituals quietly. But public gatherings were now impossible. Fear was everywhere, of arrest, of violence, of betrayal. Even those who had never danced were affected. Families buried their sacred items or hid them in plain sight. Stories of the massacre were passed orally, but speaking them openly brought risk. What the army had physically broken, federal policy now worked to erase. Wounded Knee had not only ended a movement, it had reaffirmed US control over every aspect of native life. The war had ended, but the pressure to disappear had only intensified. Wounded Knee marked the final large-scale armed conflict between Native Americans and the United States military. After 1891, no major battles followed. Most tribal nations were confined to reservations, their lands divided by allotment, and their cultures monitored or banned. The Indian Wars, as they were later called, were declared over. But for the Lakota and many others, war had simply changed shape. It was no longer fought with rifles and raids, but with laws, schools, and forced transformation. The memory of Wounded Knee persisted, not in books but in families, winter stories, and sacred sites. Survivors carried the trauma quietly. Some lived into the 20th century, speaking of that frozen morning only when they trusted the listener. For decades, official accounts stood mostly unchallenged, but the silence began to break in the late 1900s as historians revisited eyewitness records and native communities began reclaiming the narrative. Today, Wounded Knee is not just a name, it is a symbol of a promise broken, of belief turned against its believers. Yet even in that memory, the Lakota endured. They had danced for a world restored. What came was far different, but their story did not end in the snow. In the early months of 1891, military patrols withdrew from the southern Dakota plains. Spotted Elk's band was gone. The ghost dance had vanished from open sight. US officials declared the situation resolved. But for the Lakota there was no resolution, only loss. Survivors of Wounded Knee were relocated under military escort. Some ended up at Pine Ridge, others at Rosebud. Most carried nothing with them except memories. Their homes had been burned. Their dead lay in unmarked graves. In Washington, the War Department filed its final reports. The Indian Bureau resumed normal operations. National newspapers moved on to other stories. The public appetite for Indian war news had faded. Wounded Knee was no longer headline material. In tribal communities, silence became survival. Families who had lost children or elders avoided speaking about it. Some buried their grief in Christian churches, others clung quietly to their traditions. No investigations followed, no reparations were made. The massacre was officially over. Unofficially, it would echo for generations. School teachers taught a version of events where the army had acted justly. But among the Lakota, the story remained alive, passed in winter lodges, whispered under canvas, held in the language that outsiders never learned. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, US Indian policy turned fully toward assimilation. The Dawes Act of 1887 continued to divide tribal lands into individual allotments, eroding communal ownership. Boarding schools expanded, children were taken from homes, cut off from their language, and taught to reject tribal identity. Religious suppression followed. Dances, ceremonies, and traditional medicine were outlawed on many reservations. The memory of the ghost dance tied to Wounded Knee became a target of silence. Some elders refused to speak of it at all. Others warned younger generations never to wear a ghost shirt, even in private. The event itself was often distorted in official history. Government documents referred to it as the Wounded Knee Battle. Medals remained on display. The US Army made no formal apology. By 1920, few outside native communities even remembered what had happened. But inside those communities the memory stayed alive. In prayer circles old songs survived, in family stories names were kept. The site at Wounded Knee was visited quietly by descendants. The silence that followed the massacre was not forgetfulness, it was protection. In a world that tried to erase them, memory became resistance. By the mid-20th century, a shift began. Native voices pushed back against the silence. In 1973, the American Indian Movement, AIM, returned to Wounded Knee, occupying the town for 71 days in protest of broken treaties and US government policies. They chose the site deliberately. It was not random. It was remembrance. The standoff brought national attention back to the massacre of 1890. For many Americans, it was the first time they heard the real story. Native activists, historians, and elders began speaking publicly about Wounded Knee. Oral testimonies were recorded, burial sites were marked. The official narrative began to change, slowly. In schools, textbooks updated their accounts, referring to it as a massacre rather than a battle. Still, no medals were rescinded, no apology was issued, but the act of remembering, after decades of forced silence, became its own form of justice. The descendants of survivors formed councils, published stories, and held ceremonies on the land. Wounded Knee was no longer just a scar. It was a gathering place, a site of mourning and of resistance. The silence had lasted for generations. Breaking it would take time, but it had begun. In the decades that followed, Wounded Knee remained a symbol. For some, it represented the violent end of the Indian Wars. For others, it stood for the survival of native identity. Tribes across the plains and beyond began reclaiming their histories. Cultural preservation programs were launched. Ghost dance songs, once feared and forbidden, were studied again by native scholars. The site itself became a contested space. The land was privately owned, and efforts to protect it as a national memorial stalled in legal disputes. Still, Lakota families returned yearly, holding memorial runs, prayer gatherings, and quiet observances. Children of survivors became elders. Elders became ancestors. Their stories, recorded in interviews and books, slowly made their way into classrooms and public archives. Some of the descendants became artists, activists, and teachers. Others lived quietly, preserving the language and customs of their people. No government decree could reverse the past, but the Lakota and other native nations made sure the past would not be buried. Wounded Knee was not a battlefield to them. It was a grave, and also a warning. In remembering it, they did not seek pity. They demanded truth. Today, Wounded Knee stands quiet again. There is no visitor centre, no large museum, just a sloping hill, a wire fence, and a small marker where the mass grave was dug. The wind moves as it did in 1890, but the story no longer hides in silence. In 1990, on the 100th anniversary of the massacre, the US Congress passed a resolution expressing deep regret. It was not a formal apology. The medals remain. The official language still falls short. Yet for the Lakota and others, Wounded Knee is not a matter of government statements. It is sacred ground, a place where the past stands present. Teachers now tell the story more truthfully. Documentaries revisit it. Tribal schools teach it in the Lakota language. And each December, people return, runners, riders, descendants, carrying the names and memories forward. The ghost dance has not returned in the same form, but the vision that drove it, of restoration, of survival, remains. What happened at Wounded Knee was meant to silence. Instead, it became the reason to speak, not in vengeance, but in remembrance. Not to reopen old wounds, but to make sure no one forgets they were ever inflicted. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. If you'd like to hear more quiet history like this, consider subscribing. Your support truly means a lot.